Mientras que el podcast que mostré ahora es, digamos, es bien popular acá en el Reino Unido. El otro que he encontrado, bueno, no es un podcast, es un canal de YouTube, eh, creo poco conocido, relativamente poco conocido, ¿no? Él tiene 380.000 suscriptores,
Qué grande premodernista.
pero solamente tiene 20 videos, o sea, 30 o 27 videos, ¿ok? Ahora, él es anónimo, ¿ok? Porque cuando yo encuentro una nueva fuente me gusta averiguar quiénes son, ¿ok? Y cuando busco, o sea, dice, hago videos sobre temas históricos y tal. Y bueno, en su página de Patreon dice un poco más. eh, Dice que tiene un PhD en historia y enseñó a nivel de universitario por una década y ahora... Pero bueno, él dice, me molesta en la manera en que en la investigación académica se hace inaccesible al público general, porque los cursos universitarios, él está en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Cuestan miles de dólares y los editores bloquean los artículos académicos y los libros detrás de muros de pago, ¿no?
En paywall, sí.
Y entonces él quiere, su canal de YouTube es su pequeño intento de democratizar el conocimiento académico y hacerlo disponible a todos. Ahora, pero lo que yo he encontrado de él es en otro canal de YouTube le hacen una entrevista y, y entonces, bueno, les voy a mostrar primero como introducción a él pedazos de esa entrevista. La entrevista es demasiado larga. Entonces, bueno, aquí va.
This Dan Schneider video interview. It is another of my interviews with interesting websites and YouTube channels. I'm going to be talking with the man who runs Premodernist, and the conversation will begin in a minute. Premodernist is a YouTube channel that came online a few years ago. It's run by a fellow who's a historian, an anonymous historian. I'm going to be talking with him about some of his videos, about YouTube and all the hazarai that goes along with that, as well as uh, history in general. So, welcome. If you could give a little background about who you are, especially regarding uh, interests in history and so forth.
I did. Let's see. I got a degree in history. Trying to remember my life. I got a degree in history, PhD, and then I taught for a while on the college level. Oh, my specialization was medieval Middle East, and then when I was kind of in charge of doing world history. I was a small campus, so I taught world history stuff and kind of just general different topics, Middle Eastern history, some other topics, Mongol Empire, things like that.
Uh-huh.
And then I started this YouTube channel and just been doing the YouTube thing. You know, I haven't posted very many videos, but yeah, whenever I get a chance to, I put up a video.
Yeah,
Just different topics.
I was commenting just before we started recording how I thought you had more videos than just a couple of dozen that you have up there. You know, I guess it's an average of what four to about six a year, so every other month on average, a video coming out. A few weeks or a few shows ago, I did a show with three people, or two people actually, on what is history, and both of them have history degrees or sites regarding history. So let me ask you, what do you consider history, and why do you think history is a subject worth teaching?
History, there are different ways of thinking about it. Um, one way of defining it is just it's just the past, just everything that happened. But that's yeah, so that's one way of thinking about history. Another way of thinking about it is the way we think about the past, the way we narrativize it, the way we imagine the past. That's that's also like that's another separate definition of it. Um, and that's what historians are involved in, is trying to make sense of the past and come up with new ways of understanding it, which would fall into that second definition, not the first definition. The second one is the way we're perceiving the past, this kind of simulacrum that we create in our minds about the past. Is I think that's the way history usually functions socially. Um, and the second part of your question was why learn about it, why study it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It's actually a hard question to answer. I mean, I think, well, it's like any intellectual endeavor. There is reward in the doing it itself. Like if you're studying um, the hard sciences and you're learning about some scientific phenomenon, on one level, you're learning it just for the joy of learning it on it, for its own sake, just to learn more, to understand better about the world. And I mean, that's certainly why I study history. I just want to know more about what happened in the past. I just find it interesting. I find it interesting to to see the just the enormity of it, and the complexity of it, just the enormity of the past, and how many people. It's just hard to wrap your mind around how many people have lived and how many things they did, how much stuff has happened, and it's always surprising to learn more about it. So it's just the joy of discovery. But then on a practical level, because people will say, well, what's the point? What's the practicality of learning history? But I think there is a practical level to it too, which is that we as humans, we always use the past to make sense of the world we live in. And, it's always a component of whatever belief system we have, and or whatever framework we're working with socially and culturally. And so learning about history can help us to think more critically about our assumptions that we make outside of that. Like, whatever, say political position we have or cultural position we have, oftentimes there's a historical component to the way we justify that position. But that historical component is not the past itself. It's an interpretation of it. It's an artifice that we create, this narrative we create in our minds about what happened in the past that justifies the position we have ideologically or philosophically. And so learning about history can help us to think more critically about those positions we have, and perhaps even evaluate which belief systems or which ideologies are more sound than others.
So when we talk about history and looking at the 24 videos of yourself, they're all based upon human. Yet we also can talk about history in the sense of the asteroid or comet that helped to wipe out the dinosaurs 65, 66 million years ago. We can talk about Neanderthals that we dig up, or the Denisovans, or other humans but that are non-Homo sapiens. We can even go back talking about ice ball Earth or snowball Earth or Pangea, and go back hundreds of millions, if not billions of years ago. So there seems to be like this sort of fuzzy horizon where human history, and we only really use history 99% of the times in regard to humans, human history sort of begins in this sort of static fuzz of the past, and then it's sort of coming into focus as we get closer to the present day. So at what point do you think that you yourself and historians in generally start with history versus prehistory? Are we talking about 13,000 years ago when Native Americans came over, or the 40,000 years when Aborigines apparently got to Australia, or is it out of Africa 150,000 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that actually touches on another definition of history that I didn't say before, which is another way of thinking about the word history, is that it's that intellectual field that's concerned with studying written documents of the past, making sense of the past by way of the written documents. So there are different intellectual fields that study the past, and they use different methods. They do use different materials to do it. So, for example, astronomers study the past. They study the past of the universe. Astrophysicists. And they're looking at um, EM radiation coming to the Earth from outer space and interpreting that in order to make sense of the universe as a whole. Geologists study the past of the Earth, the past of the natural Earth of the planet. Anthropologists, archaeologists, anthropologists study, physical anthropologists study the what is it, the evolutionary past of the human being, and various members of the genus Homo. Archaeologists study the human past by way of looking at artifacts. So what separates the historian, history as a field, is that it looks at written documents that people wrote in the past. So to answer your question, it really depends on where you want to start. So you could start with the beginning of writing. Like that would be one way of approaching the beginning of history, would be to look at just, written, cultures that had writing, and looking at, so starting with the Sumerians. You could define it as the beginning of the human species, but then you're not just concerned yourself with history and historical documents, but you're also including archaeological data and also the new fields, genetic data and things like that, historical linguistics that inform that, so you can get a bigger picture of it. That's going beyond history per se, history as a field of studying written documents, but it's also looking at the past of human beings. If you wanted to, you could go beyond that. So there's a field of history called world history, which tries to look at history globally. And within that, there's an approach called big history. And I can't remember the author's name, the kind of the main guy who's associated with it. I think his name is Christopher. I could look it up real quick, but I guess I don't need to. But I think the book he wrote was called Big History, but he starts at the Big Bang and goes all. I think it was actually started out as a college course he taught, but he starts at the Big Bang and he does all of it, all the way up through the evolution of the solar system and the evolution of human beings, and then
is
written
he the
history
fellow
up to the
that
present.
there's a famous video online from the beginning of time until now, and it's about like a 50-minute long video or something. It's got 50, 100 million views on YouTube. It's
Oh,
quite a, no?
is it animated?
Yeah, it's animated, yeah.
No, that's somebody else. That was a
Okay.
musician that did that.
Okay.
Yeah.
General worldview historically. I mean, people sometimes have this, I guess you'd call it a Spenglerian kind of view of the world, where the world sort of goes in cycles. And
Hmm.
there's a fellow who sent me an email. I interviewed him some years ago. He predicted Trump's win, and he did so because because he believes in cycles like those Milankovitch cycles, that as the Earth or the solar system bobs up and down in the Milky Way galaxy, this leads to either male testosterone being at a high or low production or whatnot, and so you get all these kinds of odd little things. Do you subscribe to any particular view, or do you look at incidents on a case by case basis?
I think history properly done is to treat every event as a unique event. I don't think there are any kind of cycles to history or um, laws of history or any of that. No, Spengler wasn't a historian as far as I know. He certainly wasn't a historian, and if he wasn't. He didn't look at it the way I do, for sure. I mean, I just, yeah, there are people in the past who've tried to create grand narratives and to think they've discovered what they're doing is they're treating history as if it were some kind of science. It's like, well, like Milankovitch cycles, for example. It's like, you see these sorts of cycles and things like that in nature, and you think, well, history must work the same way. But human beings aren't reducible like that. They're too volatile and too, helter-skelter, going in different directions, and too complex, even on an individual level. But then the complexity is multiplied when you have millions of them, billions of them. So it's just,
So
it's just chaos. It's just randomness.
So you just stated, it sounded like you don't believe history is a science. It really can't be an art. So is history its own thing? Is it
Oh, that's
its
a good
own
point.
domain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is some art in it, in the sense of the construction of the narratives, I think is art.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't think there's anything scientific about it. So you might be onto something. I'll have to think about that some more. That might be its own thing.
Yeah,
But I
but
think it's more art than science.
so
There's a lot of personal judgment involved in selecting which documents you're going to prioritize and pay attention to, and how you're going to weigh them against each other, and then how and what you're doing, like the actual historical sources, when you're looking at them, you're being presented essentially with a bunch of random data. You know, it's if, like, if you think about it in terms of science, like imagine you're plotting data and you get a bunch of points of data on a graph, and then you have to fit a curve to those points, like of just random data, and you're trying to fit a curve to it. The curve fitting is not obvious in the sources. The underlying meaning of it is not in the sources itself. The meaning is what we bring to it.
Mhm.
The more I think about it, I think it actually is an art.
Mhm.
I think I'd probably argue that, but yeah.
But then that opens things up because art generally is fiction. So
Yes,
well
you're
then
right. Yeah,
because Willie Loman never existed.
you're onto something there. That's right. There is a fiction, in a sense, to every historical narrative.
So if that's so, how do you defend uh, claims made by people? Let's just say we could talk about modern Trumpism. We could talk about the Nazis, the original Nazis. We could talk about all of these worldviews that people have about certain things. We could talk about the history of medicine, why some people are anti-vax, even though clearly vaccines have saved hundreds of millions, if not a billion or more lives over the last century. If everything is open, and if history is a fiction, people are going to say, well, my interpretation is just as good as Professor so and so at
Yeah.
that Ivy League college. I mean, it would seem to me there has to be at least some fundamental grounding. I mean, we can't. I recently was researching Carl Sandburg, and I'm going to do a play about him. And he famously did the Lincoln books, but he was criticized widely, and probably to a good extent, that he was mythologizing Abraham Lincoln. The country needed its political Paul Bunyan in a sense.
The grounding is in the sources.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are grounding your interpretations in the actual historical data, the actual written documents that come from the past that were produced by the people who lived back then you're on, I mean, you're on steady ground. I won't say firm ground, but you're on steady ground.
Or at least
A lot of
steadier.
those, yeah, steadier, but um, the pseudo historical narratives that exist out there, they don't have that grounding. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
They're not grounded. They're just not grounded on anything. They're pure invention. They are fiction in the kind of popular sense of the word. They are simply made up. Um, the difference with the historian who's grounding into the sources is you've got a basis there of truth underlying it. And it's probably worth differentiating between history as a series of facts, a series of events. It's uncontroversial that Abraham Lincoln existed. There are certain events that happened during his life, during his career. Like, nobody questions that. But then there's another layer to it, which is the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So interpretation of Lincoln, or interpretation, for example, of what his role was in the U.S., or even on a kind of more fundamental level, like like examining, say, the Emancipation Proclamation, and what were the factors leading to it, and what were his motivations, or whatever. Like, on that level, you can't get at a firm truth behind that. You're relying on these sources and you're trying to make the best you can of these sources, but different people coming at the sources, the same sources, with different perspectives will have different perspectives on the question, and that will lead to different interpretations and narratives. But that's all grounded on the sources.
So,
Bueno, quería mostrarles, hay otras partes interesantes de este video, pero no tenemos tiempo. Pero me parece un tipo serio. O sea,
Absolutamente.
todo lo que dice me parece que tiene mucho sentido y se lo expresa muy bien. Y en su canal tiene cosas bien chéveres. O sea, hay una, viajar en el tiempo a la Europa medieval. Lo pongo un instante solo para que escuchen cómo comienza.
If you're watching this, it's because you've recently acquired a time machine and are thinking about visiting Europe during the Middle Ages.
Y entonces da consejos. Ya que vas a viajar, ya es que tienes tu máquina en el tiempo, bueno, mira, te advierto, está esto. Y entonces es un video, toda una hora. Y después tiene otra hora de preguntas y respuestas que le hicieron sobre el tema. Toda una hora dando consejos si vas a viajar a, a la Europa medieval. O sea, que me parece un enfoque bien creativo, es una manera divertida de dar clases.